Text is in the chat box. For those that don't have, if you're following from a Hebrew Bible or Hebrew text, we're in Judges chapter 3. So somebody's making quite a bit of noise. If you're not speaking, please mute yourself. Thank you. Okay.
I'm going to mute.
Great. All right, the title for today's episode is A Doubly Evil Foe, or A Double Evil Foe and a Double-Edged Sword, and those things will become evident. We've got two short stories, two anecdotes, if you will, and which this is the real part of Judges, where there's a story, a folk story, as I told you, about a hero, charismatic hero, who fights in a particular area, not for all of Israel, but in a particular area of one or a number of tribes. And there's a pattern that's followed. And we're going to go into today, what's the editorial framework for these stories and how they were parachuted into this editorial framework. There's two stories here. The truth is, it's maybe too much for us to finish in one day, but the first story was not enough for an entire session, at least I thought. Now, the ground has been laid in the first two chapters of Judges that has with it what we call a flavor of the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the one who introduced this idea of reward and punishment the way that we understand it, that not the way we necessarily understand it theologically today, but the way that we understand Judaism to be. It wasn't necessarily like that outside of the book of Deuteronomy, meaning that if you are good boys and girls, then rain will come on time and you will defeat your foes and the land will be cleared of them for you, and you'll benefit as long as you just keep the laws of God. First and foremost, you need to keep the laws of the ultimate, the quintessential anti-God laws are worshiping other gods. And we had a lot of that in the first two chapters beforehand. We also got the background information already that the land was not clear of the enemy. The former residents still live there. And at the time of Joshua, Joshua didn't do the trick, didn't finish that. Not everything was finished with Joshua. Okay, so let's begin. Why, Dan? Why don't you read 1 through 6, please?
These are the nations that the Lord left so that he might test by them all the Israelites who had not known any of the wars of Canaan, so that succeeding generations of Israelites might be made to experience war, but only those who had not known the former wars. The 5 principalities, the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, Sidonians, and Hivites who inhabited the hill country of the Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon to Lebo Hamath. These served as a means for testing Israel, to learn whether they would obey the commandments which the Lord had enjoined upon their fathers through Moses. The Israelites settled among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters to wife and gave their own daughters to their sons, and they worshiped their gods.
Okay, so we have a number of things have been brought up here, and the truth is potentially, I think, 3 reasons why they still had a lot of conquering to do. So what are the reasons that you see here, anybody? Why are they still at war? Anybody's free to.
Well, I'm looking at the list of the people they settled among, in Torah, those are people that are supposed to drive out, and they haven't.
Well, why is it? I'm trying to unmute you. I can see you raise your hand. Madalena, again, we have the same problem.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Can it be a test that is being given?
Right. So not can it be a test? One of the reasons given is it's a test. What is God testing them at? What does God want to find out?
See if they have still taught what their fathers and grandfathers had been taught. Did they still believe the same basic fundamental attributes of what the Moses generation would have been thinking and talking about and doing, along with Joshua? And Joshua wasn't that far in the past.
No, it's actually the previous, really just the previous generation. Dan, did you want to go on?
Yeah, he wanted to test if they were capable of fighting. That's how I read it.
Right. So there's two. The truth is there's two. Both of those reasons are given there. One is,
Mhm.
the first one is that they need to learn how to fight. They're not yet fighters. And it seems that what God wants to happen here is that they win the wars on their own without God's help. That's one of the rationales given in this paragraph. There continue to be wars because God's not going to be, it's almost saying God's not going to be there to take, to watch over them all the time. They need to win a war on their own. That's kind of one. The other idea is what Alan said, is because God is testing them. It's like what I said about the Lubavitcher Rebbe's comment about why are there dinosaur bones in the soil, to test our belief, to make sure that we have faith in the fact that the world was created between only 5,700 years ago. And so there's those two things, and there's one more reason that's given at the end while they're still at war, although it's not said explicitly.
Worship their gods.
Well, that comes together with marrying the daughters, intermarriage. And the example, or par excellence, right, of someone who married and went astray, anybody know? King
Moses.
Solomon.
No.
Of all people, King Solomon, right? He had all these wives, and then they brought with them, again, that's the editorial comment in the Book of Kings, not necessarily the original kernel of the text, but all through these books now, the editorial comments of the Deuteronomistic redactor or person who gave his final stamp to this text, or the group of people, is that it all boils down to idolatry. That seems to be the main thing. And one of the ways that you go back, you backslide, is by marrying into these people. And it's an interesting thing because in some cases there's explicit laws not to marry into them ever. And we're going to see something like that. We're going to refer to that in a few minutes. And in other cases, you can marry them. So it seemed that there wasn't one opinion on this, right? It's the Deuteronomists who really had this idea: don't marry out. Intermarriage was not, as we can see from many cases in biblical literature, was not that taboo as you would have thought, especially growing up in Jewish early part of the 20th century and beforehand.
Wasn't this always a problem? Wasn't this always a problem throughout everything they're talking about? When you were to go out and conquer, you had to kill everyone so that there was no opportunity for you to have these intermarriages. Wasn't it always like a thread throughout all this?
No, that's our challenge, Eric. That edict exists for only some of the peoples, right? Like the Canaanites, but it doesn't for other people. So, for instance, you don't have to kill. There's no mitzvah to kill Egyptians. In fact, it's kind of inferred that you're going to get along with them at some point. Yet it was Solomon who had a wife from Egypt who led him astray, according to the, and so there is that message out there, but it applies really only to some of the nations and not all the nations. But there's a tension. What I'm trying to say is that not everybody agreed to that. And that's the struggle. It's a spectrum. There's a spectrum, political spectrum, as they're using.
Was it only like a generation after Joshua that his Jews started to the intermarriage?
No, we're going to see that all through. I mean, this is this is still a preamble to the Book of Judges. We're going to see that motif throughout Judges. Right. And,
yeah, but before that, there wasn't that much intermarriage.
Well, when they were on their own, again, according to the narrative, when they're on their own in the desert, there's not really who to marry with. Okay. Right. And then in the book of Joshua, I mean, I don't know if this is, I think there are passages. I haven't looked at Joshua Truth is,
But even before Egypt, was there a lot of intermarriage?
all the time there was intermarriage. There was tension. There was tension, and that some of the forefathers said about their and mothers said that their children should not marry Canaanites, and that they did. Judah had a Canaanite wife, right? Others are mentioned in the genealogical list that we've seen in Genesis and in other places. So yeah, it is there. In other words, it's not so black and white. Well, that's what I'm trying to say. It's not so black and white.
So
Didn't Moses intermarry?
Yes, yes. What I'm saying, it's not black and white, everybody. It's
Right.
not black and white. Okay. Michael, I think you wanted to say something.
yeah, so do you think the problem is intermarriage or worshiping their gods?
So that's a good question, because the first part of your question is there something genetically problematic, ethically, genetically problematic with mixing of blood? And that may have been in the background. And that, of course, is, if you're thinking of United States, our country, right, and laws, that exactly is what it is, and could very well be. But the way it's posed here and by the Deuteronomic editor is that no, it really has it's a theological. They will draw you away from the right way. It's sociological, religious sociological, as opposed to
Eugenics.
ethnic. Yeah, eugenics. Yeah, but that good eye. That's that, and so yeah. Okay, so let's leave it at that. Let's leave it in a mixed bag. Yes, Sid.
Just one more comment. I think it works both ways to a certain extent, because after all, our president now, all his grandchildren are Jewish.
You mean our ex-president?
No,
No,
I mean
our new president, Biden.
What?
all of his grandchildren are Jewish.
How is
Okay.
that
All his
possible?
children married Jews.
You know what? I'm sorry. That we're gonna get back to the text now. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for that, Sid.
That was just a comment.
I know, and that's why I'm bringing us back. Okay. So that idea that going back to this war, there's this tension. War is directly related to theology, right, and to the cult, and to the ritual practice. But it's also something that prowess in war, as we're going to see, is seen as a gift to God, a gift by God. And that's why it was Rabbi David Radak who said here that the testing of the people, that they need to be better in battle, was part of God's plan. So there's this, in other words, if to be good, I mentioned before a number of times that I believe that reading the book of Judges is important to understand Zionist thinking and the state of Israel, and especially right-wing politics in Israel. So imagine everything you know, and many of you have heard lectures and read books about the early days of Zionism. Zionism was was part of an overall global or European movement of nations, of ethnicities, raising up and wanting to have independence. That's what happened in Europe. And so Zionism is definitely part of that. But there was this added task for Zionist thinkers, and Jabotinsky was probably the most famous of this, to create the new Jew. And the new Jew was not the kicked around, downtrodden, sucking up to the goyim, that kind of thing. No, but was one who could stand up and defend themselves, right, and hold weapons. And when we get to Samson, we're going to talk about Jabotinsky and a novel that he wrote based on the story of Samson, which is in order to promote that idea of Jews. It's about time you take up arms and defend yourselves. And so that's very much in the background here as well. The diaspora for modern, certainly 19th, early 20th century Jewish thinkers, it pushed the Jewish people down. It subdued them for this particular aspect of military prowess. And so that becomes something to rise up against in the 20th century. Somebody had mentioned, I don't think that person's here right now, that they expected me to talk more about Zionism in this class. Well, no, these are the real text of this class is Judges, but every once in a while I do want to raise that issue up. And that, by the way, and we'll get, and that idea of heroes as military heroes, not just prophets as being heroes, or priests as being heroes, or even a king as being a hero, but an informal judge, and we'll see again that we'll have to deal today with that, the meaning of the word judge, shofet, was in the background of creating this new Jew. That's also why it was in Europe, Central Eastern Europe, began to take an interest in the apocryphal literature as well, the books of Maccabees and Judith. There was a renaissance of that literature in Jewish circles at the end of the 19th century, because again, you found in those books Jews that were different, a different kind of model than most Jews were adhering to or following. Okay?
David, there was
I
a
did,
One at a time, please.
go ahead.
Jackie, go ahead.
Well, did God want the people at this point in time, was he trying to test them for their military strength to take over territory so they wouldn't just live in one little village and never move on? Was that the idea of making them warlike or being
Yeah,
able to?
yes, but I would rephrase is not to live into one little village. I don't think it's being presented as the Israelites living in one little village. It's the Israelites are living in different little villages around the land, but they still have this Canaanite presence or this presence of the others. Yes, absolutely. The military prowess wasn't military prowess for its own sake, but it was in order to free the land.
So they weren't subjugated to the,
Yes.
right. Okay.
Scotty, did you want to say something?
No, I just want to say the image of the fighting Jew in the 20th century Zionism wasn't just Jabotinsky or right wing, it was also left wing. It was.
Absolutely. I mentioned Jabotinsky because he's the only one who wrote a novel called The Life of Samson, which we'll get a lot to when we get to that. But yeah, absolutely, very much so. I mean, Palmach mythology takes from this just as much. Absolutely. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. All right then. So let's go on. If there's nothing, just a mention here about the Philistines, the 5 principalities. The word there is Sarnei Plishtim. We don't really know what the word Saren means. A lot of different understandings. In modern Hebrew, Saren is a captain. It's a rank in the army, 3 bars. And so we're not sure exactly, but it seems like the Philistines, they had 5 cities, and each city was an area that was ruled over by a semi-king, maybe, more than a chieftain, but less than a king. And those were Ashkelon and Ashdod and Gat and Ekron and Gaza, those 5. So that whole area, which if you think in your minds now, Ashdod, Ashkelon, right? So it's kind of in that way ironic, these newly founded, built up cities like Ashdod was totally founded in this state of Israel. Ashkelon existed all those years. Gaza existed, and then with the tension between Gaza now today and the rest, those are 5 of the Plishtim, the Philistine cities, and we know from as we read through this historiography, we know that they never really were pushed out. They were always there to be a thorn in the side, literally in the side. In the western side of the Israelite tribes, especially Dan. Okay. All right, Scotty, would you read 7 to 11, please?
Okay. The Israelites did what was offensive to the Lord. They ignored the Lord their God and worshipped the Baalim and the Asherot. The Lord became incensed at Israel and surrendered them to King Cushan Rishatayim of Aram Naharaim. And the Israelites were subject to the Cushan Rishatayim for 8 years. The Israelites cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised a champion for the Israelites to deliver them, Othniel the Kenizzite, a young kinsman of Caleb. The Spirit of the Lord descended upon him and became Israel's chieftain. He went out to war, and the Lord delivered King Cushan Rishatayim of Aram into his hands. He prevailed over Cushan Rishatayim, and the land had peace for 40 years when Othniel the Kenizzite died.
Okay, so before anything else, you got to love this guy's name, right? Cushan Rishatayim mi Aram Naharaim. So Cushan, Cush we know is Africa, but Cushan and the an ending is typical for names. We don't really know much about this guy, and Aram, it could be anywhere from Syria onwards up to the northeast, but let's say the area of Syria. Naharaim, if we take it at face value, the way that it's pointed in Masoretic text, the way we have it is that it's two Naharaim. The Aim, like Yadaim, Raglaim, Oznaim. The Aim at the end means two, not always, but in most cases. And so Naharaim would be two rivers. And sometimes some interpreters and translators even went as far as Mesopotamia, right? The land between the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. And you get all these kinds of conjectures as to it's the Euphrates with one of the offshoots, and I don't know where it is. And the truth is that it's a little bit far-fetched to think that this little guy, Othniel, who was important in the tribe of Judah, was making war with a king from from Mesopotamia. It makes more sense that perhaps it was closer to home, maybe Syria, if there is a historical kernel to this. But you gotta love the name. Kushan Rishatayim. Oh, I didn't talk about Rishatayim. So if Naharaim means two rivers, Resha is evil, Rishatayim is doubly evil. And it sounds like the best interpretation I ever saw of this was that this is a good example of how this literature was oral, was passed on orally for generations. Just because of a name like that, it's so. And you can, I can imagine little kids in the kindergarten running around, Kushan, Rishatai, Miaram, Naharaim. It's kind of, it's. I love this guy's name. We don't know anything else about him, other than that there was a war. Othniel, we met him beforehand. Remember, he got married to Achsa. He was given Achsa as a prize for his military prowess. So I guess it's important because now we get to the actual anecdotes of the wars that I'll talk about the editorial framework in a second. Who is the tribe that it starts with, begins with?
Judah, you said.
Judah, right. Remember that in the end, there's always this competition between Judah and Benjamin and Ephraim. So we want to take a look at those things as well, because when this stuff is written, they still remember things from before. There's this ongoing competition of tribes, and when we get to the next story, we'll see it as well, and connected perhaps to the book of Esther. But right back in this story, what is the editorial framework I've been talking about so much? It begins with the Israelites did what was offensive in the Lord, and we're going to see that time and time again. And they ignored the Lord with different words, but more or less the same idea. And they worshipped Baalim, Asherot, they worshipped other gods. And then God became angry with Israel, all right? And then he caused an enemy to be greater than them, and then comes us, and you've got this bad situation. Then the Israelites will cry out, they'll pray, they'll kvetch, they say, "Oh God, we're sorry, please save us." And then God will raise up a savior, a Moshiach, a savior, a charismatic leader, who will lead them in war against the enemy. That's the middle part of the framework. That's the story, the individual anecdotal stories, the anecdotes. And then it will come back, and then it will say, and then the land was quiet for such and such years, right? Until the people again forgot God, caused God to be angry. They forgot to worship, and the whole cycle goes over and over. And this cycle is repeated number of times throughout the book of Judges. All of Judges is basically a series of those kinds of episodes. So that's when I say the editorial framework, that's what I'm talking about. And that is in the spirit of and this literary style of the book of Deuteronomy. So that's why we call him the Deuteronomic editor or redactor of Judges. And the truth is, in Samuel and Kings, you see the same footprints, literary footprints. Okay? Yes, Michael. Go ahead.
How much of this do you think is kind of post hoc explanation of being conquered by someone else? In other words, you're conquered and you say, oh, because we are conquered, we must have done something wrong and, worshipped other gods.
So you ask how much? All of it.
Okay.
It's all entirely written from a critical point of view, academic point of view. It's all written in retrospective of hundreds of years, and a very particular retrospectacles, right, of seeing history in this way. In fact, all of the historiographical works from Joshua to the end of Kings, that whole section is seen basically is an explanation to one question. My friend Zakovich, and I mentioned yesterday, my very good friend and teacher, Yair Zakovich, it's just been announced that he's receiving the Israel Prize for Jewish Studies for Biblical Research, which is a huge, huge accomplishment. Really, it's really the top of accomplishments. Nobel Prize, Israeli Nobel Prize for Israel, for Nobel Prize for Israelis, and so Zakovich always says that people would come and say, well, of course, Professor, David is described that way because we believe in our heroes as being blemished human beings. And I know we say that, and in a Jewish approach to recovery as well, we often use the fact that Moses, all of our heroes are blemished. They're imperfect. Rabbi Mark Borowitz has a whole Torah, the Torah of imperfection. And I totally plug into that. But Zakovich says, but that's not the overall purpose. The overall purpose of presenting David or any of the people themselves or any of these heroes as being blemished comes to explain one thing: why they lost. Because if God prophesied that David was going to be the king forever, the Davidic line, for instance, right? And it's not, because the temple was destroyed. And even when the temple was rebuilt, Davidic kings never went on. And even when there were kings in the Maccabees, they were priests. Now I'm talking from a rabbinic point of view, they're from a priestly family. Then the whole point of these books is to say, we're paying the price for David being blemished, for David's sins, right? But all the more so when it comes to the whole nation, right? So everything is retrospective. Yeah.
Yeah, Rabbi, I just finished reading with my other class. We actually just did the destruction of the northern kingdom in 2 Kings chapter 17, and just to see the language is almost exactly the same between what we read here and God wiped out and literally, apparently according to the rabbi I'm studying with, literally profanity in 2 Kings, the Gilulim, which you could only translate into English, in a profane way. It's just it's just interesting to see exactly the same theme of you didn't follow God, I'm going to wipe you out.
Right, and hence people talk about the Deuteronomic editor of all these historiographical books. I think, Alan, you wanted to say something.
Yes, I just wanted to ask if we saw a timeline from the time that Moses led the people to the promised land. And now we saw other things happening. The people had settled in, we were being tested, and suddenly we're getting a new element, and that is the concept of a different form of self-government. That is, you're having chieftains who are being chosen for their military, their athletic prowess, and their religiosity. They are very close to God. The rising up of the chieftains, if you were looking at a timeline, is there anything equivalent to this going on in any of the other lands surrounding where these stories are taking place? In other words, is there any equivalency?
I understand.
Okay.
So I will I'll answer the end of your question first, and then I will reject the question in some ways. So the answer to the question is that yes, in documents from Mari, and that's the contribution mostly of Jack Sasson in this relatively new volume of the Anchor Bible. He brings a number of cases. There is similar literature from around the same time. Perhaps it's a little bit older. Not my expertise. That stuff is new for me. I kind of shied away from ancient Near Eastern parallel literature, Gilgamesh, all that kind of stuff I didn't concentrate on. Our daughter, by the way, has far more expertise. I studied Greek as a second language, ancient language, when I was at Hebrew University in the master's program. When she was in the same program, she studied Akkadian. And so she's more, and she works at the Bible Lands Museum. She's better versed in this kind of stuff. So perhaps, in fact, we will have her on as a guest at some point, and she'll be able to show us some artifacts, I hope. But Sasson does bring parallels. But then now I go back to rejecting the question, or the premise of the question, because you're assuming kind of a linear development of how it went. And I don't think in reality it was like that. And the literature we have doesn't reflect a linear development of, say, the Israelites learning 40 years, getting the Torah. And from an Orthodox point of view, perhaps there is, right? They were under Moses and then under Joshua, and Joshua passed the Torah, Moses passed it to Joshua, Joshua passed the Torah onwards, and you've got that linear kind of development or preservation of oral law, of the oral Torah. But as far as wars were concerned, they were fighting wars in the desert, in the wandering of the desert. They were fighting wars when they got to the land. They're fighting wars now. So the wars are all along the time. We have literature telling those stories. So that's from a military point of view. From a theological point of view, they were kvetching and sinning in the desert. They were kvetching and sinning in Joshua's time, and they're kvetching and sinning in this time as well. So in other words, there's really no development. I know that an Orthodox rabbi would probably present this differently, but
It's okay.
But
That does answer my question. Thank you.
All right. Somebody else had a question as well, or wanted to say something. Okay. All right then. What else do we want to say here?
I have one question.
Sure.
Is the book of Judges, was that written by one of the prophets?
According to the only passage in the Talmud, a few lines that talk about who wrote what book, it's the prophet Samuel who gathered this information.
Oh, and then he went on to write Samuel.
Well, no, only the first part of Samuel, because he dies in the book of Samuel. If you remember, if you got to the point where Nathan takes his place, right?
Yeah, that's the second book of Samuel.
Right, but that's the only source we have in rabbinic literature.
Okay.
So it's interesting that didn't seem to be a burning issue for our ancestors. Who wrote what book? And to me, that I like that. That's a flag to me that says it's not about the history or even the authorship. You're sure we deal with that now. I talk about the Deuteronomic Editor because I think that that leads us to understand the various layers of thought and values that are reflected in one text, because it's been written and rewritten over so many centuries even. But it's interesting. There's only one passage in the Talmud that deals with this, and not a lot. Even Moses, by the way. So Moses wrote the Torah, but not the whole Torah, right? There's the discussion about the last few verses because it tells about Moses's death. But I'll try to bring that source once. I don't think we've done that. I'll try to bring. It's a good source to know. It's in Baba Batra someplace.
Thank you.
15. Thanks for the question. Okay. All right then. So let's go on. So this was our first judge. We don't have details about what did he raised a judge. It says towards the end, Vayishpot et Israel, and he judged. He that's the word shofet, judge. And he judged the Israelites. So what does that mean? By going out to war. In other words, the definition here, the inner definition here is that the meaning of judge, and Michael, you asked and others asked before, and so what does that mean, shofet? Why the name of this book? It's not judging the way that we think of judge in our society. The word judge here is understood as leading the people to war. Okay, so that's another thing, Alan, what you said. It's not that they are, it's not that the people have chosen him, right? That's another really important part of the book of Judges. The people are not electing. We're going to see stories in Judges about whether people are electing or supporting or not supporting their leader. But the person, the choosing of the person here was done by God. That's clear. And this is the first of the stories. God is the one who bestows the blessing of military prowess and leadership on to the person. I think in the end, that's what charisma is. Well, in mythology, right? Charisma is also blessing from the God, is it not? Anybody? No? Okay. So let's go on. Jackie, why don't you read?
12 to 14.
Yeah, so that's the first of the stories that have some meat. Now we've got a story that's got a lot of meat on it. And I don't know that we're going to be able to finish it. Go ahead today.
The Israelites again did what was offensive to the Lord. And because they did what was offensive to the Lord let King Eglon of Moab prevail over Israel. He brought the Ammonites and the Amalekites together under his command and went and defeated Israel and occupied the city of palms. The Israelites were subject to King Eglon of Moab for 18 years.
Okay, this is the introduction to our story. So if it was first Kushan Rishatayim of Aram Naharaim, now it's Melech Eglon, King Eglon from Moab, of Moab. Now, before we get to Eglon and his name, what do we know about Moab, people? Who remembers where Moab is or where it came from?
I think it was sort of southeast, just east of the Dead Sea.
Exactly, right.
Okay.
And what's
It was the Philistines.
No,
No.
Philistines are the other end, Jackie.
No.
Philistines are
They're
the
the west.
So this is the other end of
they're on the
modern
west.
Israel, okay? And where do they come from, the Moabites? Anybody remember?
There's legend has it that they are descended from some relation of the Israelites.
So I love the fact that you say, I love
Wasn't it Lot's daughters? Lot and his daughters?
Yes. So I love the fact that Harold said legend has it. As if there's legend and there's
Historical fact.
It's all legend.
Oh,
That's the same answer to Michael, right? It's all of it. So yes, Richard, you got it right. That's one of your favorite stories, probably, right? Where Lot is fleeing from Sodom, from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and wife is told not to look back. Wife looks back. She turns into a pillar of salt. Lot and his two daughters, they go up to where they go to head out. As far as they know, the world is destroyed. And the girls say, well, who's going to populate the world if not us? And so they get their father drunk, and consecutive nights they sleep with their father. And hence the name Moab, according to the etymology, the folk etymology in the book of Genesis, I think it's Genesis 19, Me'av, from father, Moab. And the other child of that illicit union is Ammon, also Ami, from my people. In other words, it's kind of a play on incestuous. Both of them have incestuous interpretations. And so you can imagine ancient Israelites calling their enemies, your mother was that kind of a thing, right? And so the Moabites are, say, east of the Dead Sea, a little bit north, and then come the Ammonites above them. So that's the background for those two nations. How about the Amalekites? Where do they live? Anybody? Or what do you know about the Amalekites?
I thought, did they live somewhere between Canaan and Egypt? Because when the Israelites were going through the desert, the Amalekites attacked them or stopped them from going through their land.
Right. So they could be just nomadic people. We don't know. We don't have a particular nation place to where the archaeological remains or anything. They show up, but remember that Saul, King Saul, who's from the tribe of Benjamin, right? From the tribe of Benjamin, King Saul, he fights the Amalekites, and that's why he lost his kingship, because he didn't eradicate them. He didn't kill the king and the women and the children and the sheep, right? Apropos what you mentioned before, this idea that they all have to be killed. So Benjamin has a relationship with the Amalekites there. Anybody think of another biblical story that there's a relationship between Benjamin, tribe of Benjamin, and the Amalekites? You know why? Because you never heard it. You don't hear it because everybody's busy making noise with their grogger,
Oh, Haman.
Haman is the Agagite.
Agagite.
Right. Agag was the king of Amalek. So, and what tribe does Mordechai come from? Ish Yemini, Benjamin. Right. So it's interesting how there's a tradition going through, a trickling down through biblical literature of the Benjaminites fighting the Amalekites. And that might be why the Amalekites were dragged into this story, because they're guns for hire. They're troublemakers. That's, you find some commentators say they were mercenaries. Right? They don't have a vested interest in the land. Maybe it's their hatred of Israel. Some people would say, based on text from the Torah, maybe it's just their hired swords, or maybe I would say perhaps because it's a way of bringing in Benjamin's arch enemy into a story of war with a Benjaminite, which we're going to see in a second. But before we go on to learn about our hero, what is the king's name? Eglon. Does that say anything to anybody?
Eglon.
An egel.
Egel is a calf.
A calf. So Eglon would be little calf, the on at the end, right? Like Shimshon is little son. So Eglon, a little calf, or yeah, let's think of that. You might think it's not terribly complimentary name, but Rivka, her name I think is also connected to the bovine family somehow. I don't remember how. A lot of names, especially women's names, are based on animals. Devorah, Bi, Rachel, Ayu. Yeah, okay. So, right, so we've got this, and of course, what does he do? Moab, he moves across the Jordan River, and he conquers the most important city or town of the time, which was, we already had it, the City of Palms, which is another name for?
Jericho.
Jericho, exactly, okay? So you have here a story of, imagine the land like this, and there's an incursion from the side. Somebody is going, a chadira, a penetration from the side. The king of Moab, who is calf-like is in his name, with a humorous name, is going in and has captured an important city. That's the background to what's going on now. And this God let happen because the people of Israel did evil in the eyes of God. Okay. Harold, you want to read?
Okay. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up a champion for them, the Benjaminite Ehud, son of Gera, a left-handed man. It happened that the Israelites sent tribute to King Eglon of Moab through him. So Ehud made for himself a double-edged dagger, a gomed in length, which he girded on his right side under his cloak. He presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now Eglon was a very stout man.
Okay, so we're getting pieces of the story, pieces of the background that the narrator is feeding us at times to, which is part of the art of telling the story here, that will help us understand the story. Let's take it one at a time. So again, part of the literary framework or the editorial framework is that the Israelites, they repented, they did tshuva, they cried out to the Lord. So then God raises up, right? Remember, the people don't choose him. God has chosen this hero, raised him up. And what is his name? His name is Ehud. Ehud, although Sasson doesn't think it means anything, I like the interpretation that it's from the word hod, which has to do with royalty, right? Something high, something aristocratic. So you've got the king of Moab, who's got this name as a calf, as we'll see. He's very healthy. We'll get to that in a second. A healthy calf, or a fat calf, a fattened calf. And then we have our particular hero, whose name is Hod. Yet, from a physical point of view, what's going on with him?
He's a lefty.
Yeah, so that's what the text here, this translation says. The Hebrew is iter yad yamino, and nobody really knows what iter is, but I prefer those that interpret it not to be left-handed, but that he has a defect in his arm, maybe a withered arm. He's disabled with his right arm. And I think that's important for the rest of the story. Some will argue that it was the Benjaminites from 2 verses, one in Chronicles and one at the end of the book of Judges. Some will say, oh, this was a Benjaminite practice to train people to be ambidextrous, right? To be able to use both hands in fighting, right? The way we see ninja kind of fighters or whatever they might be. But I like the idea. I think it's important to think that he has a very majestic name, yet physically he's imperfect. Whereas Eglon has a majestic stature as a king, but physically he's imperfect from a different way. He's fat, as we'll show in a second. But and then he has a name which is a kind of a ridiculous name. And there's a bit of a play here as well. What tribe is he from? Benjamin, which means
Benjamin.
Benjamin, which means
the son of the right hand.
Son of the right hand, and yet his right hand is deformed, is disabled, and that's an interesting play as well. I think it's part of the humor of this story. Okay, now we get to that last line there, and now Eglon was a very stout man. In Hebrew, it's Veglon ish bari ma'od, which in modern Hebrew would be he's very healthy. This reminds me of a story when we were kids, teenagers. One of our counselors, his mother came to visit Camp Ramah, California. When she came into the gate, she got to the office and she met 4 of the women who were the age of counselors, and they were all rather buxom young women. And she got out of the car and she said, all you look so healthy. I remember her saying, you look so healthy. And so that's not this, right? This is, you eat well, huh? You eating well? When you think if in ancient times, if you had, I don't think people knew that if you were overweight, you were unhealthy. I don't think they knew that yet. If you were too skinny and you were underfed, then you were unhealthy. So he was very healthy. In other words, he's a shlob. He's a fat king. That's how I think this story, the playfulness and the irony or the satire even of this story, is this king who dares to make an incursion into the promised land by penetrating into a particular area. And here he is sitting in his summer house or his winter house, whatever it is, he's sitting in his special room of his palace in the city of Palms in Jericho. Now, what else do we need to know? They're paying tribute to him. In other words, they're sending a gift of whatever it was, agricultural, or whatever, gold, silver, whatever it might be. They're sending the tribute to King Eglon. We have to imagine that he's got a lot of schleppers. Ehud is at the head of the contingency. He's going there, and he has schleppers bringing all this stuff. We'll see. We need we need to think of that detail in a second. So they're coming in. They're infiltrating his space, the King Eglon's space. They're going into his space. He's gone into their land, right? And pushed them out of Jericho. They've come in, Ehud and his schleppers come into the palace to bring Eglon this tribute, right? Because if he's fat and he's very healthy, then one might imagine that he's a bit greedy. Oh, I can't wait. Let's see what they brought for me. Okay, I know I'm reading into stuff, but hopefully you'll see why I'm able to do that with how the story develops. Okay. Trudy, would you like to read 1820?
When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he dismissed the people who had conveyed the tribute. But he himself returned from Pesilam near Gilgal and said, Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you. Eglon thereupon commanded, Silence! So all those in attendance left his presence, and when Ehud approached him, he was sitting alone in his cool upper chamber. Ehud said, I have a message for you from God, whereupon he rose from his seat.
Okay, so a lot of things happening here. That's the sign of a really good story, good narrative, is that every word gives us more information and it gives us more color to what's happening. So the tribute was the the way to get in. That was their cover story, right? The cover story is to get in to see the king by bringing the tribute. And when they were done bringing the tribute, he sends the schleppers away. So he goes with them to a certain area, to a place called Psilim. Psilim means the carved place. Could be carved stone, could be carved wood. There are tons and tons of explanations as to what this might be. It's near Gilgal. Gilgal is a ring of stones, so perhaps it were idols, chiseled stone or chiseled wood at that ring of stone, because it was a holy place. Whatever it was a geographical location that people seem to know. And as we're going to see here, it's also a literary location. It is what we call an inclusive. It demarks a particular literary unit. When Ehud goes from the Psilim, when he's within the area of the Psilim, of these carved stones, then he's in danger. So he's left his people, he's shepherded them out. He's gone past that particular area. Some people say it's a quarry, right? That's where, I don't think that's a good interpretation. I like to think of there's these things called kuduru in ancient Near East archaeology, which are boundary stones. And on them, they have faces or chiseled in bodies of gods. And I'm thinking that could be, and that's what people did to set up their territory. If you dare pass this stone and infringe upon my territory, trespass, then these are the things that are going to happen to you. And so it leads us to believe that Ehud is in heightened danger when he comes past these Psilim, and then he comes to have an encounter with the king. And how does he get into the king? Remember, he's trying to infiltrate, trying to go deeper and deeper and deeper. So he goes from the Psilim, he goes to the palace. From the palace, he says, I need to talk to the king. I've got to go into the king's private chamber. And then he wants to go even deeper. He says, I've got something special to tell you. I have something from God. Oh, and then again, this fat king is saying, what kind of thing might he have for me? And the word davar is a double entendre. It means word, but it also means thing. And both of those meanings are doable. And so this king is inviting Ehud to come closer and closer and closer. I forgot to talk about the double-edged sword. That's one of the most important things, because it's the gun that's on the table that we know is going to be used at some point, right? So a double-edged sword, probably, we don't know how long a gomed is. Is it a full a cubit, as some people say? Probably not. Is it the span of a hand? Maybe. It's a short stiletto kind of a thing. And we'll see in a second why it's important that it's double-edged. As one of the Israeli commentators has a picture of a sword from this time, which was more of a sickle kind of a thing, but not with a sharp inner edge, with a sharp outer edge, in which that's how people would fight. They would fight like this, slicing and hitting people with this sharp sword on the outer side. This was to say this was a straight stiletto kind of a thing. Okay. I think in the 1930s, somebody found, it was sold on the open market, some kind of ancient, something from from the second millennium BCE, that everybody said, oh, this must be the same kind of sword. People love to see reality in what they find. Okay, so we've got him. And then why does Eglon stand up? So you've got the traditional commentators say, because Ehud said, I have a word from God. So out of respect, Eglon, because he doesn't just believe in his God, he believes in all the gods. That's one of the things that in all the stories, it's not that people don't believe that Yud-He Vav-He is a god or even a powerful god, but they believe that Yud-He Vav-He is one of a number of gods. And so perhaps the traditional commentators said he stood up because he was getting that word. Other people would say, well, he stood up because he's so excited to say, what have you brought me? What else have you brought me? Okay. Any questions before we go on? Okay, remember, he is left hand, or his right hand is no good. He has put a sword on his right thigh, either on some people say on the inside, some people the outside, whatever it is, it's under his garment, so he's snuck in a weapon. Okay. Michael, would you read for us? 21, 24.
Reaching with his left hand, Ehud drew the dagger from his right side and drove it into Eglon's belly. The fat closed over the blade, and the hilt went in after the blade, for he did not pull the dagger out of his belly, and the filth came out.
How's that for detail?
That's more than I want to know.
Right. Most people don't expect to see this kind of detail, this particular kind of detail, or this kind of detail in a biblical story. That's why I love this story so much. So, of course, he's not suspected. That's why I think it's not because he's ambidextrous. He's not suspected because they could probably see that his right hand, was not well. He's like this or something like this. So he reaches over, pulls out this very sharp double-edged sword, double-edged knife, stiletto, sticks it into this fat man's. Now you see why I say he's fat. He's not just healthy, he's fat. Sticks it in. He's so fat that the knife goes all the way in, and then the blubber closes on the outside of it, which is important as well because he doesn't get covered in blood, does he? He keeps the knife inside. And so remember I said this motif of chadira, of infiltration, of going inside, penetrating. So because Eglon penetrated into the promised land where he shouldn't have been, the story goes that Ehud penetrated his outer circle, his inner circle, his palace, his room, and then penetrated himself, and penetrated him so much that he didn't even take out the knife. That's super penetration, people. And then what was this all for? As we're going to see, this is all for getting the Moabites out of the land. So just as there was a crescendo in penetration, it starts now with coming out. What comes out? The innermost drek, literally the drek, comes out, because when you get a knife wound to the stomach, that's what happens, right? And the word that's used here is a strange word. It's the only time it's used, but let's not go into that right now. So all right. So why is it important to know that the shit came out, Sid? Don't answer me. Not just because it happened, of course, but because of the next verse. Why don't you read the next section?
Stepping out into the vestibule, Ehud shut the doors of the upper chamber on him and locked them. After he left, the courtiers returned. When they saw the doors of the upper chamber were locked, they thought he must be relieving himself in the cool chamber.
Okay, so remember now there was this penetration. Now it's going out. It started with the going out of his kishkes, and then he goes out of the room, and he's leaving the palace. And as he's leaving, he's got to buy himself time. So what does he do? He locks the door. Now, why did Eglon's servants not go in and bother him and tend to him?
They thought he was relieving himself.
Why did they think he was relieving himself?
Smell it.
They could smell the shit.
Oh.
No, this story is ingenious in how much it's packed into every word. They could smell it. But of course, that also gave him time, and he closed the door, he locked the door. Okay, so go ahead, read another section, Sid.
They waited a long time, and when he did not open the doors of the chamber, they took the key and opened them. And there their master was lying dead on the floor. But Ehud had made good his escape while they delayed.
Very, very shortly.
Yes.
Just want to say.
And escaped to Sirah.
Okay, see here. All right, so he makes his escape. That's how he buys time. And remember what I said about the psilim? When he left his people, they were safe. He goes back from the psilim into danger. He goes into the danger area, does what he does, escapes, and then he goes past the psilim. We don't need to know about the psilim, where they are. It's a literary device which I said is called an inclusio. I pointed it out other times when we studied as well. And the inclusio means to sign, is a sign for us to know that now he's out of danger. He's out of personal danger. Now remember, this whole story was to answer the penetration of the Moabites into the land by penetrating V'od ech, and how, penetrating how into the leader of the Moabites in order to get them out. So his innards go out, he goes out. So it's the same motif of going out now. Now, what happens next, Alan?
27, 28.
When he got there, he had the ram's horn sounded through the hill country of Ephraim, and all the Israelites descended with him from the hill country, and he took the lead. Follow me closely, he said, for the Lord has delivered your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands. They followed him down and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites. They let no one cross.
Okay, so he goes into the land of Seir, which is interesting why that's brought here. That's territory belonging to Esau, right? Esau, Jacob's brother. But he goes out to that area. Perhaps they were hiding in the hills. You can imagine the hillsides, the canyons of the on the other side of on the western side of the Dead Sea, the canyons and everything. He blows the shofar. They all come out because now the ding dong, the witch is dead, right? The king is dead, and they can rise in battle. And again, to push them out, but now they do. Oh, and then it includes the people of Ephraim, which may be because they're not exactly there. They're from their areas north of there, but may include it because this is the second story. The first story was about Judah, and the second story is about Benjamin, but also Ephraim. In other words, those are the top royal families in the annals of Israelite history. First, it was Benjamin with Saul. This is after the book of Judges, but when it's written, it's already history. It was Saul, and then it was David, and then the Davidic line of Judah split, and then it became the kings of Ephraim, of the sons of Joseph. Okay, so blow the shofar, rally the troops, and so what do? It wants to show that they're still kind of guerrilla fighters. They don't just let them drive them across the sea. They come around from the south, let's say, and then they capture the ford back into the land of Moab, the fords of the Jordan River. So they've got them in a bind. They've got them surrounded on all sides. And the last part, go ahead, Alan, the last part of our story.
On that occasion, they slew about 10,000 Moabites. They were all robust and brave men, yet not one of them escaped. On that day, Moab submitted to Israel, and the land was tranquil for 80 years. After him came Shamgar, son of Anat, who slew 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He too was a champion of Israel.
Okay, so interesting.
Shamgar, is that Samson?
No, interesting that the Moabites are also like their king. They're healthy. Here it says robust, but the Hebrew is shamen, which literally means healthy. So there's a playfulness to this, right? They were also heavy. They weren't skinny little weasels, right? But the Benjaminites, they got the best of them, and the rest, and they slaughtered them, and the land was quiet for a long time. Then I added on this last line because that's all we have about Shamgar, the son of Anat. So the interesting thing there about Shamgar, and we do have a number they call them minor judges. It's just a little story. It's the remnant, it's the footprint of a story, which we don't have the rest. It's interesting that Anat is the name of a Canaanite goddess. It's Baal's wife, Baal's girlfriend, Baal's mate. And that's her name, Anat. So that's an interesting name unto itself, and also it's a female name. I don't think it's a male name in any case, but that's for another time. So as you see, there was an initial penetration, and then the motif of penetrating went from the king of Moab penetrating to Ehud penetrating even to the body. Then what's the opposite of penetration? outitration. Was there some word?
Extraction, extirpation.
Well, it starts with a kishkiz, and then it's with Ehud going out, and then it's the Moabites going out. And so I just think it's a lovely story, and I am so happy that I got to share it with you.
Now, I wanted to ask about Anat. Is that a fairly common woman's name in Israel today?
It is. It is, which is interesting because, again, it's a Canaanite goddess's name.
Yeah.
But you don't find it, at least you used to not find it amongst Orthodox Israelis.
Right.
One of those names like Hagar that you found amongst secular Israelis,
Yeah.
or Nimrod, certain names that are were not so, accepted in traditional circles. Okay, so Deborah, welcome to you. I don't know if you've joined us before. We're happy to have you here.
All of the sessions except for one.
Oh, okay. Well, good. All right. I'm glad you're here. Sorry I missed you. All right. Everybody all right?
Yeah, Rabbi, one more thing.
Okay.
I read about kudos to you for your doctorate. I think that's wonderful, and it's about time.
Well, thank you. Except for, we do want to say it's an honorary doctorate, and I have a lot of respect for academia.
But still.
So it's a nice honor to get. It's what some of the rabbis call, if you're still alive after 25, 27 years, JTS gives you a doctorate if you're a rabbi. If you're still alive. That's the accomplishment. So, but thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, then. So we'll see everybody next week, huh?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes, definitely.
Excellent.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye, thank you.
Rabbi.